After my father's funeral, my mother-in-law asked about my inheritance. I said $0. She evicted me, but after my father's funeral, my mother-in-law asked about my inheritance. I told her it was 0. That's when everything in my life began to unravel. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. The funeral had ended only minutes before. People were still gathered around the grave, whispering their condolences, their voices carried off by the cold wind. I stood there in a suit that didn't quite fit me, staring at the fresh dirt piled high where my father had just been lowered. My chest felt hollow, like a piece of me had been buried with. Emily, my wife, held my hand lightly, almost like she was afraid of the weight of my grief. She said nothing, her eyes darting toward the line of cars where her mother, Margaret, stood waiting. Margaret Whitfield didn't look like a woman who had just attended a funeral. She looked restless, impatient, as if she had somewhere more important to be. When she finally walked toward me, her heels sinking slightly into the grass, her face carried no softness, no sympathy. She didn't even bother with the polite words most people use. Instead, she looked straight at me and asked, "So, Daniel, what did your father leave you?" The words cut through the silence around us. Emily shifted uncomfortably beside me, but she didn't speak up. I blinked, caught off guard. The question wasn't just rude, it was cruel. My father's grave was still open behind me, and she wanted to talk about money. I cleared my throat, my voice low and flat. "Nothing. He left me nothing." For a moment, Margaret's mouth tightened. Then she let out a small laugh, the kind people use when they think they're above you. "Well, I suppose that's not a surprise," she said. "He didn't have much to his name, did he?" I didn't answer. My hands curled into fists at my side, but I kept my eyes on the ground. I could feel the sting of humiliation creeping up the back of my neck. Emily finally whispered, "Mom," but her voice was weak, like she was trying to quiet a child, not stand up to her mother. Margaret ignored her. She leaned closer to me, her perfume sharp and overwhelming, and said, "This is why you should have planned better, Daniel. A man should have something to pass down. Nothing to inherit means nothing to stand on." I wanted to tell her that my father gave me plenty, his time, his lessons, his love, things that money couldn't buy. But standing there, with Emily silent and Margaret glaring at me, the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just turned back toward the grave. The last handful of dirt had been thrown, and the wind picked up, scattering the flowers across the ground. My father was gone, and I was left with nothing but grief, and the sharp sting of judgment from a woman who would soon show me just how far her cruelty could reach. It was only a week after the funeral when Margaret showed up at our front door. I hadn't been expecting her, and the knock she gave was sharp, more like a demand than a visit. I opened the door and there she stood, dressed in one of her tailored coats, her hair pulled tight, her face set like stone. She didn't bother with a greeting. Instead, she held out an envelope. I took it slowly, unsure of what it was. She folded her arms, watching me the way a banker might watch a man about to be denied a loan. I opened it and read the first few lines before the words hit me all at once. An eviction notice. "This is a mistake," I said, my voice low, almost a whisper. "This can't be right. This is our house." Margaret tilted her head, almost amused. "No, Daniel, this is my house. I let Emily live here because she's my daughter, but technically, this property has always been mine. You didn't think I'd hand over something like this to you, did you?" The air seemed to leave my lungs. I looked around, at the living room I had painted, at the kitchen where I had fixed every broken hinge and squeaky cabinet. I thought it was ours. I never knew it was just another one of her possessions. Emily came down the hall then, her eyes wide when she saw her mother. "Mom, what's going on?" Margaret didn't look at her daughter. Her eyes stayed fixed on me. "What's going on is simple. Daniel has nothing. He admitted it himself. And if he brings nothing to this household, then he doesn't deserve to stay in it." She stepped closer, her voice cold as glass. "If you bring no money, you bring no worth. You're out." Emily's face flushed red. She glanced between me and her mother. "Mom, you can't just—" "I can." Margaret cut her off sharply. "I have every right. And unless you want to find yourself out on the street too, I suggest you think very carefully about where your loyalty lies." I stood frozen, the paper trembling in my hand. Humiliation burned through me, hotter than grief ever could. It wasn't enough that I'd just buried my father. Now I was being told that I wasn't even worthy of keeping a roof over my wife's head. Emily reached for me, but her hand stopped halfway, as if she couldn't quite decide which way to lean. Her eyes were glassy, torn between the man she married and the mother she feared. I searched her face, hoping for some sign of defiance, some word of defense. But none came. Margaret adjusted her coat and turned toward the door. "You have 30 days. I suggest you start packing." The sound of the door closing behind her echoed in the quiet room. Emily stood silent, her hands twisting together. I stared down at the notice, my name printed at the top, and felt the weight of betrayal settle heavy on my chest. This was the moment I understood. I was not only grieving my father, I was beginning to lose everything else too. The weeks after Margaret handed me that notice felt heavier than the dirt at my father's grave. I tried to talk to Emily about what we were going to do, how we could fight this, or maybe find another place together. But every conversation turned into an argument. At first, it was small things. She would sigh when I came home from work, her eyes going to my clothes, dirty from long hours at the job site. "You can't expect us to get anywhere with what you're making," she said one night, her voice sharp. "We're not kids anymore, Daniel. We need stability." I told her I was doing my best, that losing my dad had already set me back, but she didn't seem to hear me. The more we talked, the more she repeated her mother's words. "A man should be able to provide. Mom says you're stuck, that you're dragging us down." Those words cut deep, not because they came from Margaret, but because Emily started believing them. She said them with conviction, like she had decided somewhere along the way that her mother was right. The fights became routine. Money, bills, what I wasn't doing, what I should already have. She looked at me like I was failing her, failing us. And no matter what I said, it wasn't enough. I worked harder, picked up extra shifts, but instead of softening her, it only seemed to fuel her frustration. One night, I came home earlier than usual. Her car wasn't in the driveway, but the lights in the kitchen were on. When I stepped inside, I heard voices, hers and Margaret's. I froze just before rounding the corner, the sound of their conversation spilling into the hall. "He'll never be more than what he is," Margaret was saying, her tone cold but certain. "You can't build a future on a man like that. I told you from the start." Emily's voice was quieter, but the words still found me. "I know, Mom. I know. I don't know how to walk away. Not yet." It felt like someone had put a hand through my chest and crushed whatever was left inside me. I didn't go into the kitchen. I turned and left before they could see me standing there. My footsteps sounded louder than ever, and the silence in my truck was unbearable when I sat down behind the wheel. That night, when Emily came home, she acted normal, like nothing had happened. She asked about dinner, sat on the couch, scrolled through her phone. But I couldn't look at her the same. I couldn't forget the sound of her agreeing with Margaret, the way she sounded tired of me, like she was already planning a life that didn't include mine. From then on, even when we were in the same room, she felt far away. She pulled back when I reached for her, her eyes always distant. It was like my wife was slipping through my fingers, and no matter how hard I tried to hold on, she was already gone. It happened faster than I ever thought it would. One evening, I came home from work, and the house felt hollow. Drawers half open, closets emptied, the shelves bare. Emily had taken most of what we owned, furniture, dishes, even the framed pictures off the walls. All that was left behind were things she didn't care for, and a silence that pressed down on me like a weight. Her car was gone, but she came back later that night, not to stay but to finish what she started. She stood in the doorway with her coat already on, as if she couldn't wait to leave again. Her eyes were sharp, her jaw set in a way I hadn't seen before. "So that's it?" I asked, my voice breaking as I looked around at the stripped-down room. "You're just walking out?" "I'm not walking out," she said flatly. "I'm moving forward. I can't keep living like this, Daniel. I can't keep waiting for you to become something you're not." Her words hit me harder than a punch. "Emily, I'm trying. You know I'm trying. I'm working every day. I'm doing everything I can." She shook her head, almost like she pitied me. "It's not enough. It will never be enough. Mom was right about you from the start." Hearing her say it out loud, not in whispers to her mother but to my face, made my chest tighten. "So you're choosing her over me?" I asked. "I'm choosing a life where I don't have to worry about bills piling up or wondering if we'll be kicked out of a house we can't even afford. I'm choosing stability. You'll never be able to give me that." The silence between us was thick. My hands curled into fists, not out of anger, but because I couldn't think of anything else to do. I wanted to shake her, to make her remember who we used to be, but I could see in her eyes that it was useless. She gave a bitter little laugh and added, "You'll never be enough for me without money." The words lingered in the room like smoke. After that, she turned and walked out. I followed her to the driveway, but she didn't look back. The sound of her car engine filled the night, then faded as she drove away to her mother's estate, where she would have everything I couldn't give her. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space she left behind. Inside the house, there wasn't much for me anymore. Just my father's old toolbox, a few clothes, and my truck parked out front. That was all I had left. It was in that moment, standing under the dim porch light, that I knew my marriage wasn't just cracking, it was gone. Margaret had pulled the strings from the start, and Emily let her. What I once thought was our life together had only ever been borrowed time. Now, I was truly on my own. The apartment I found was nothing more than 4 walls and a roof, tucked on the edge of town where the streetlights didn't always work. The carpet was stained, The pipes rattled every time I turned on the sink, and the heater gave out more often than it. But it was the only place I could afford after Emily left, and I signed the lease with hands that still shook from everything I had lost. Nights were the hardest. I lay on a mattress on the floor, staring at the cracked ceiling while the sounds of neighbors fighting or music blasting through thin walls filled the room. The silence inside me felt louder. I thought of my father, of the way he used to tell me, "Son, a man doesn't need riches to build a life. All he needs is his hands and his will." Back then, I never thought those words would become my lifeline. Bills piled up on the counter. I picked up whatever work I could, fixing fences, patching drywall, repairing leaky roofs. I carried my father's old toolbox everywhere, the same one he once used to keep food on our table when times were rough. It felt heavy in my hands, not just with tools but with the weight of his memory. Every screw I tightened, every nail I hammered, I thought of him. Still, it wasn't enough to drown out the sting of betrayal. Emily's words haunted me, her laugh when she told me I'd never be enough. Margaret's cold stare when she told me I had no worth. I carried their voices around like ghosts, reminding me of the hole they'd left in my chest. Some nights, I wanted to give in to believe them. But each morning, when I pulled that toolbox out of the truck and set it down at a job site, I felt a spark. Small but alive. My father had built everything he ever had with his own hand. Maybe I could too. Not for them, not to win Emily back, not to please Margaret, but for me. To prove that I wasn't what they said I was. The apartment still felt cold, the bills didn't stop coming, and I still woke up with grief pressing down on me. But every nail I drove into wood, every wall I fixed, made me feel like I was carving a path forward. A path that didn't depend on anyone's approval. Revenge didn't need to come through anger or shouting. I began to understand it could come through rising higher than the people who tried to tear me down. My hands, scarred and blistered, were proof of the work I was putting in. And slowly, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could build something greater than what they ever imagined. The first months were slow, but work started to find me. At first it was neighbors or small landlords who couldn't afford big company. They wanted someone who would show up on time and charge a fair price. I did that. I showed up early, stayed late, and never left a job half done. Word started spreading. One client told another, and soon I had more calls than I expected. I moved from patching holes and fixing fences to bigger projects. Kitchen remodels, bathroom renovations, entire basements. I didn't have much, but I had my father's tools and the lessons he drilled into me. Work hard, don't cut corners, and always leave something better than you found it. Those words became my way of doing business. Clients noticed. Some even invited me in for coffee after the work was done. They treated me like more than just a handyman. They trusted me. That trust turned into friendships, and those friendships turned into referrals. Before long, my phone buzzed almost every day with new jobs. I took a risk and registered a company name, Miller Renovations LLC. It was just me at first, but seeing the name printed on paper felt like proof that I wasn't the failure Margaret claimed I was. I even bought a used pickup and painted the name on the side. Driving through town with that truck felt like carrying a piece of dignity wherever I went. The work grew, and with it my bank account. For the first time in years, I wasn't drowning in bills. I still lived in that little apartment, but I could keep the lights on without fear. Every paycheck reminded me that I was climbing, step by step, out of the hole I had been thrown into. But the pain didn't just vanish. At night, when the tools were packed away and the jobs were done, I still thought of Emily. I thought of the way she had looked at me before she left, the words she threw at me like knives. Those memories didn't disappear, but instead of breaking me, they pushed me. Each time her voice echoed in my head, I worked harder. Around town, I started hearing things. People whispered about Margaret, about how not everything in her world was as perfect as she wanted others to believe. She had put money into ventures that weren't paying off. Deals gone bad. Properties she was struggling to hold on to. The thought of it didn't bring me joy right away, but it stirred something deep inside me. For so long, she had held her wealth over me like a weapon. She believed money made her untouchable. But now, cracks were forming in her empire. I didn't know exactly where it would lead, but I knew one thing. I was no longer the man standing broken at her mercy. I was building something with my own hands, and this time, it was strong enough to last. Emily thought moving back into her mother's estate would bring her comfort, but it didn't take long for her to see the truth. Margaret didn't treat her like a daughter. She treated her like a possession. Every choice Emily made was questioned. What she wore, who she spoke to, even what she ate seemed to be under her mother's control. Margaret didn't just want her close. She wanted her dependent. At first, Emily tried to convince herself it was worth it. She told herself she had security now, that she wouldn't have to worry about bills or scraping by. But the walls of that mansion felt more like a cage with each passing day. Margaret was sharp with her, reminding her constantly that she had saved her from a useless husband who could never give her the life she deserved. Emily started to regret the decision she had made. She thought about me often, about the nights we used to sit together with nothing but a simple meal and a laugh, about how even in our hardest times, I had never tried to own her. Regret pressed down on her, but she felt trapped. Margaret had a way of twisting words, making Emily believe she had no way back, no way out. While their relationship grew colder, the estate itself began to crack too. Margaret's investments, the ones she bragged about at dinner parties and used to show her superiority, began to fail. People whispered in town about bad business deals, about money disappearing into ventures that never paid off. It wasn't just gossip, the signs were clear. She sold off smaller properties quietly, and staff who had worked for her for years were suddenly gone. Soon, even the mansion carried rumors of foreclosure. The image Margaret worked so hard to protect was starting to crumble. Behind her stiff posture and proud voice, panic was setting in. I heard about it through clients and neighbors. People in this town talked, and word always found its way around. Some spoke with pity, others with satisfaction, but everyone knew Margaret's grip on her fortune was slipping. When I learned, I didn't smile, and I didn't spread the gossip further. I kept working, kept my focus on the jobs in front of me. Part of me remembered how she had stood in front of me after my father's funeral, asking about money while the ground over his coffin was still fresh. I thought about the eviction notice she shoved into my hands, about the way she told me I had no worth. Now it was her who stood on shaky ground, her who feared losing everything. And though the knowledge stirred something deep in me, I stayed quiet. I didn't need to say a word. The world was doing the work for me, and all I had to do was keep building. Years passed, and the work I poured myself into became more than just jobs. Miller Renovations grew from a one-man effort into a company people in town trusted. I hired a crew, bought more trucks, and took on projects that once felt impossible. My name carried weight now. When people talked about quality work, they mentioned mine. With success came security. I no longer worried about bills or rent. I bought properties of my own, some to renovate and sell, others to rent out. The little apartment where I started felt like another lifetime. Now, I was the one holding the keys to homes that others depended on. The same town where I was once looked down on now saw me as a man who had built something real. Meanwhile, Margaret and Emily's world kept shrinking. The estate that once stood as a symbol of power was breaking apart piece by piece. Land was sold quietly, jewelry and valuables disappeared, and Margaret's name was no longer spoken with the same respect. What she once used to look down on others was now slipping from her grasp. I didn't chase the details, but the truth always found me. Clients mentioned auctions, friends in real estate talked about desperate sales, and the whispers grew louder with each year. Margaret's empire was falling. Then came the moment of irony I never could have planned. A property came up for sale, one Margaret had bragged about for years, calling it her jewel. It was prime land in town, a place she once swore she would never part with. But now it was listed quietly, no flashy announcement, no celebration. Just another piece of her legacy sold off to cover debts. I bought it, not as Daniel Miller, but through Miller Renovations. The papers were signed with no fuss, and her prized possession became mine without her even realizing who held the deed. The day I got the keys, I stood on that land and let the wind hit my face. It wasn't about gloating or shouting. It was about knowing I had taken, with my own hands, what she once believed I could never touch. By then, my business was strong, my reputation solid, and my future secure. I didn't need to run from eviction notices or wonder how I'd pay for the next meal. I had built a life from nothing, just like my father always said was possible. And yet, I couldn't forget the past, the way Margaret humiliated me when I had nothing, the way Emily chose her comfort over our vows. Their downfall wasn't my doing, but owning what was once their pride felt like a quiet form of justice. I didn't rush to confront them. That moment would come on its own. For now, I waited, holding the deed in my hand, prepared for the day when Margaret and Emily would see that the man they cast aside had risen higher than they ever imagined. The day of the showing, I pulled up in my truck, the company logo shining on the side. The property was one of my best renovations, a clean 2-story house with fresh paint, new windows, and a yard that finally looked alive again. I had seen the application, but I hadn't believed it until I read the names twice. Margaret Whitfield and Emily Miller. Life had brought them right to my doorstep. I stepped out with the keys in my hand. The front door was already open, sunlight spilling across the polished floors inside. When Margaret and Emily arrived, I watched their faces carefully. At first, they didn't notice me. They walked the sidewalk slowly, both thinner and more tired than I remembered. Margaret carried herself with the same stiff pride, but the sharpness in her eyes was dulled. Emily followed a step behind, her face pale, her movements small. When they finally looked up and saw me, the color drained from Emily's face. She stopped in her tracks, her mouth parting slightly, like she wanted to speak but couldn't. Margaret froze too, but she recovered faster, her lips pressing into a thin line, as if she could will the situation into something less humiliating. "Daniel," Margaret said, her voice cool but shaky at the edges. "What are you doing here?" I held up the keys, calm and steady. "I own this property. You're here to see if it's worth renting." The silence that followed was thick. Emily looked down at the ground, shame written across her face. Margaret's chin lifted, but I could see the flicker of panic in her eyes. She hadn't expected this. She thought she could fall quietly into one of my homes without ever knowing whose name was on the... "You!" Margaret scoffed, though her voice was thin. "You're telling me you own this house?" I didn't flinch. "Not just this one. A few others in town too. But this one's available." Emily finally whispered, "Daniel." I didn't know. I cut her off, not unkind but firm. "We're not here to talk about the past. This is business. If you want the house, these are the terms." I laid out the rent, fair by market standards but higher than what they could comfortably manage. I told them the deposit would be non-negotiable, the contract strict, late fees unforgiving. My voice was steady, professional, without a hint of emotion. Margaret's face tightened. She tried to hold on to her pride, tried to stand taller, but her hands shook slightly as she clutched her purse. Emily stayed silent, her eyes glassy, unable to look at me for long. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply handed them the paperwork, the same way she once handed me an eviction note. Only now the roles were reversed and the power sat in my hand. "Take it or leave it," I said, sliding the papers across the counter. "It's your choice." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. For the first time, Margaret had no reply. Margaret and Emily signed the lease. Their hands shook as they put their names on the paper, but pride wouldn't let them walk away. I kept my face still, businesslike, and handed them the keys without ceremony. They were tenants now, nothing more. At first, I didn't think about it much. They moved into the house, and I went back to my work. But it didn't take long before the cracks showed. Rent came late. Maintenance requests piled up. Margaret tried to act like the same woman she once was, but I could see the struggle in her eyes each time she called. She wasn't in control anymore, not of me, not of her life. One afternoon, she showed up at my office. She didn't knock. She just walked in, dressed in clothes that no longer carried the same shine, her makeup unable to hide the tired lines on her face. Emily trailed behind her, looking smaller than ever, her eyes red. Margaret set her purse down on my desk and leaned forward. "Daniel," she said, her voice low, almost pleading, "the rent is too high. You know our situation. We can't keep up like this. You could give us a break. You should give us a break." I leaned back in my chair, studying her. For a moment, I saw her as she once was, the woman who stood in front of me at my father's funeral, the woman who told me I had no worth because I had no money. The memory came back sharp, and my reply came without hesitation. "If you bring no money," I said slowly, "you bring no worth." Her face went pale. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but nothing came out. Emily gasped softly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Daniel, please," Emily said, her voice cracking. "I made a mistake. I see it now. I shouldn't have left you. I shouldn't have listened to her. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Please forgive me." Her words trembled in the air, but they didn't touch me. I didn't feel anger, and I didn't feel pity. What I felt was distance, like I was standing on solid ground while they were drowning in water they once pushed me into. I slid the contract across the desk toward them. "The terms are the terms. Nothing changes." My voice stayed calm, steady. No shouting, no bitterness. Just business. Emily sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking. Margaret sat stiff, her pride shattered but her silence louder than anything she could say. I picked up my keys, stood, and walked past them without another glance. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky orange over the town I had rebuilt my life in. I climbed into my new truck, the seat still carrying the same toolbox that once held me together when I had nothing. My father's old tools sat beside me, scratched and worn, but strong, just like the life I had built. I turned the key, the engine roared to life, and I drove away, leaving them behind to live in the shadow of choices they could never undo.
Hi besties, thank you so much for watching to the end. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe.